I just walked in and I thought that was a real person. That actually just terrified me.
Hello.
Oh! This tiny sewing needle seems very insignificant. As crafters or sewers or knitters, we all own one of these. But have you actually thought about where it comes from? What was the history behind this? Like, how did we get to this part? Well, what if I told you that there was once a town in England that was responsible for making all of the sewing needles on Earth? Yeah, gag. So at its peak, around 90% of the world's needles came from a town called Redditch, and I went there. I'm currently in Birmingham, never been to Birmingham before, no idea where I am, and I'm waiting for the train to Redditch to see some needles. Also, I am really close to the Cadbury's world, and I am tempted because I would eat that shit up so fast. Even though Cadbury's chocolate has gone downhill, but whatever.
Service for Redditch.
So, Forge Mill Needle Museum and Audsley Abbey Visitor Centre ruins. Today, hidden away outside of Birmingham, Forge Mill Needle Museum tells the story of an industry that helped build the modern world. And today, we're going to be exploring it and talking about the history of the museum, the history of actually making a needle, and why it's important. Humans have been sewing with like bone needles for around 60,000 years, and then steel changed everything. Before that, before we had steel, it was like tin and copper, which didn't make great needles because of it would bend and snap and be quite fragile. So unlike bronze or iron, steel could be hardened. It produced needles that were super strong, thinner, sharper, and far more durable. This method of hardening steel is thought to have originated in China, but it's thought Spanish immigrants are the ones that brought it to the UK. And around 1545, Spanish immigrants brought packs of their super strong needles into England and basically gagged us. Most of the needles made in Britain before that were made by like local blacksmiths, and they were made of iron, but it was not kind of hardened steel, not iron. They were made of steel, but not the hardened steel that the Spanish had kind of basically developed. So all of our needles were not great. They did the job, you know? And there's a quote that I don't know where I got the quote from. I'll put it on the screen here. So this is a quote that says, quote, "Owing to religious persecution in Europe, there was a great influx of aliens into this country who brought with them the vital knowledge and secrets of many trades. Among those immigrants were 15 known needle makers. John Stowe, a tailor born in 1525, wrote, 'Needles were first made in England by a Moor in Cheapside during Mary's reign, and again by Elias Clark, a German, in 1569, who came to England at that time with his 2 sons and 2 journeyman servants. He applied to join the blacksmith's company along with 5 other aliens, but their entry was refused. He then went across the Thames to Southwark to escape the jurisdiction of the company. But even then, they were compelled to take English apprentices to teach them the art and mystery of the trade.' When I say aliens, I don't mean like actual aliens, just put that out there. They mean immigrants. So the Spanish and German immigrants kind of brought their needles over. We also did start to import their type of steel from around Europe as well, because it was much better quality. We had not cracked the code yet to kind of harden steel. So when we began to import these high quality needles from Europe, it kind of promoted a lot of people to start selling them. So we had a lot of like needle sellers popping up around London, Wales and Ireland, so basically everywhere. And this happened until around 1563, when an import act was kind of put in place to kind of stop this importing of all these foreign goods. It was putting people out of business. This act was actually called, it's a mouthful, an act avoiding divers foreign wares made by handicraftsmen beyond the seas. It's a mouthful. And this was kind of done to provide a balance between the trade and kind of increase employment within England. However, because obviously the Spanish came over and had all this kind of this better wire making treatment to kind of make better iron. I keep saying iron, it's not iron, it's steel, Matthew. But yeah, the advances in wire making enabled the English tradesmen to stop kind of relying on importing of wire from Europe, and this kind of helped trade flourish in England and made steel needles more affordable for everyday people.
This is how a needle starts its life. It's a coil of wire, it's carbon steel, and I'm going to pass it round and I want you to feel how hard that is. Obviously, in Victorian times, it was Sheffield steel. The wire drawers, they would have to, they'd start off with a lot thicker wire, and they draw it down to the diameter that they want by using this thing here called a Worshipful plate. So you're going to put wire through this plate here, and then you're going to physically pull it through this sort of cone-shaped hole. Now it goes through successive diameters. So the first hole is a little bit smaller than the gauge of the wire, and then it's drawn down successively until you've got the diameter that you want for the type of needle. The Victorians were brilliant at doing Royal Commission reports into their working lives of people, and they said that you could always spot the wire drawers around the village because they were missing parts of their fingers and had terrible lacerations.
And eventually one English town, Redditch, would use this to kind of build their needle empire. So why Redditch? Why is Redditch so important in the invention, or not the invention, in the making of needles? Well, needle making had actually been going on quite a long time in Redditch before the kind of introduction of this hardened steel. And the story starts in about 1639 when the first kind of needle makers would start to settle around Redditch. So there was like a few different, when we say Redditch, we're not talking about like the Redditch center. Redditch was kind of like spread out, so there's a few kind of villages around there. And what started as like a handful of craftsy men working in their houses kind of grew into like a big manufacturing industry because they had kind of all the elements there to make it massive. So as the needle industry evolved throughout the years, competition increased, and the industry started to kind of migrate towards the north because it was closer to like all of the steel industries such as Sheffield and Birmingham. It also kind of had a lot more water to kind of enable water-powered factories and things like that. And Redditch was in like the perfect prime location for that because it was about 15 miles outside Birmingham. It had a stream that was running down it called the River Arrow, and it already had kind of the main, because they were already making needles there, so they were there and ready. So they got such a perfect head start. By the late Victorian period, the town was producing 3.5 billion needles a year, which is 90% of the world's entire supply, which is crazy. And we're not just talking like sewing needles, we're talking like fishing needles, surgery needles, dart needles, like anything that's like pointy, like a needle, like even you know, the needles on record players that kind of spin round, like even them, like it was such a big industry, and all of it came from Redditch. Yet behind this industrial triumph lay long hours and dangerous working conditions. But it meant like a whole generation of like skilled craftsmanship could literally transform a piece of steel into like one of like humanity's greatest kind of inventions. Argue with me in the comments, but I think it is one of them. And then during the kind of Industrial Revolution, everything kind of changed because I was there. Like needle making used to be such a slow process because, you know, there's many different components to making a needle.
Cottage needle makers hammered out their own needle stems from wrought iron. Early on in the Industrial Revolution, the ability to draw wire proved to be a great advantage, as this saved a great deal of forging time and effort. The gauge of the wire determines the size of the needle. Pieces of wire cut to the required needle length had to be straightened by rolling on a wooden block. The next stage is to flatten one end of the wire on a steel anvil in order to make an eye. After this, the position of the eye has to be marked using a suitable punch. The position is marked on both sides of the flat, and finally, the eye is punched out on a lead anvil. It is also punched from both sides. Whilst the eye is still impaled on the punch, the sides are hammered up to form a gutter down which the thread can pass. The eye and thread path have then to be cleaned out on a wood block using a guttering iron. Afterwards, it is given a final clean-up. To complete the needle, the wire has to be pointed at the other end using a suitable file against a wooden block, and this is the finished needle.
During the Industrial Revolution, there were new machines every day that could kind of, cut the steel better, cut thousands of needle blanks, like thousands of needles, as well as like punching all their eyes through and then polishing them. So there were so many kind of advancements in needle making, and with things like water wheels and steam engines, this could power factories and help produce even more needles every week. So now that we talked about kind of like the industry, how were needles actually made? And it's actually quite complicated, because you don't think of you see a sewing needle and you're like, piss easy, it's a bit of steel, but it's actually really complicated, and I'm going to tell you now. So in the creation of making a needle, it's actually very, very intense and a long process. Each one passed through more than like 20 separate stages before they got to the end point, and you'd have stages such as drawing steel wire, grinding razor sharp points on the needles, to punching the tiny eye holes in them, and then hardening the metal in the furnace, because this is what kind of gave the material, well, the steel, its kind of flexibility, but also it was a lot stronger. One of the most important steps of making a needle was the end, so one of the last stages, and this kind of involved polishing the needles. So yeah, the freshly made needles were really rough and dull and blackened because of all the process they'd gone through.
And then they put it like this, they make it, and it's a strong canvas middle piece, and then one set could contain anything up to 30,000 needles. And then you're going to add this wonderful ingredient, which is basically powdered stone. It's a local quartzite stone, so you'd have handfuls of that over the top. You would then add some soft soap, which I'm not going to touch because it looks horrible, and then you're going to tie it up very tightly until it looks like that. Now, this is why you need the water wheel. You see these things here? These are called scouring beds, and the water wheel would make them go backwards and forwards, and you catch the momentum of the bed, and then you lift it up, and you can see there's a lip here as well, so it can't fall off the edge.
Yeah.
And so you put these underneath, that heavy weight goes over the top, and it's been rubbed and rolled like that for about 8 hours. At its height, Forge Mill was scouring something like 3 million needles per week. And there are 32 scouring beds in all, 16 upstairs, 16 downstairs.
For all of its success, needle making had a dark side, and the most dangerous job belonged to the pointers. And the clue's kind of in the name. Their task was to sharpen the needles, and they would sharpen thousands of needles a day against a rapidly spinning grindstone. As the stone wore away, it filled the air with clouds of dust, and this dust was mixed with particles of steel, and day after day after day, it went deep in their lungs. And many developed a illness called pointer's rot, leaving them with like a chronic cough, coughing up blood. And I think I read at the museum that the average pointer lived to about 3 years after starting the job or something. Pointers rarely lived beyond the age of 35 years, and a survey of 150 pointers in 1839 showed an average age of under 28 years. It's interesting because when the industry started to evolve and they wanted to kind of make it a little bit safer, they tried to implement fans to kind of circulate the air and kind of put it outside the mill, so the people doing the pointing weren't going to die of this pointer's rot, because it was kind of extracting all of the crap out. And all the pointers started to kick off because this was one of the highest paying jobs, and obviously if it wasn't safe anymore, it wasn't going to get paid as much, so people were striking, which, yeah, and this was implemented in 1870. It says here that every attempt to introduce extractor fans was resisted by the Redditch pointers, culminating in a strike in 1846 which lasted nearly 12 months. They feared better working conditions would lead to reduced wages, but eventually the strike was broken. So it's kind of interesting how people would rather be at risk and have pointers along because just to get money. If that's not capitalism, I don't know what is. But it's actually not though, because it's kind of like reverse capitalism, because if the conditions were really, really bad and it was keeping costs down low, but they were paying them more, and they've just paid money to keep people... I don't know. I'm not an economist. So now we're going to talk about the history of Forge Mill. So the history of Forge Mill stretches back more than 450 years. The site began life as an iron forge, which kind of where it gets its name. The site's reliable water power made it an ideal location for needlemaking industry. And in around 1729 to 1730, Redditch's needle industry started to expand, and the forge was then converted into a needle scouring mill. So rather than focusing on all aspects of making needles, the forge mill specialized in one of the most important aspects of needle making, which was the scouring or polishing. And this is what I mentioned earlier about them putting all the needles in the buckets with all of the emery powder, the oil and the soap to kind of polish them. But what made the forge mill amazing was the use of water power.
So Ches, how long have you actually been looking after and maintaining the Waterwheel?
1971 we came down here, we met Mr. Rollins, and he sort of pleaded with us to come down and see whether we could give him a hand. I think there was a dozen of us who started, and like I say, it was in such a mess, it was falling to bits. The bearings were shot, the wooden pallets were broken, gone rotten. This was a swamp. And so it seemed like a good idea at the time to give Mr. Rollins a helping hand. But I never thought it would go on for nearly 50 years. I use a crowbar to pinch the wheel to start it up, and once it starts, the whole system comes to life. The pit wheel and the driver are not the original ones. Oliver Gray and his two sons got a firm in the Black Country to make us the new ones, and they're a lot stronger, and they've got different things in, like tungsten and bits and pieces to make them last forever.
Through a network of shafts and gears throughout the building, this system kind of powered all of the work that was going on in the mill, and basically meant that they could scour continuously, allowing like thousands and thousands of needles to be made and polished, not made, polished. And with the introduction to steam in the 19th century, this was added in as well to supplement the water wheel, and basically just meant like it was to go. And at the peak of the Victorian era, Redditch produced 3.5 billion needles a year, and the forge mill was one of the key businesses that helped make this possible. And the mill continued operating until 1958, where they were still using the original equipment. That's gagged, that's gaggy, and it was one of the last working needle scouring mills in Britain. But instead of it being demolished, like so many other like industrial buildings that's happened, luckily it was preserved and then reopened as the Forge Mill Needle Museum in 1983, and it was opened by Queen Elizabeth II, sorry, should know that. And today it's now home to the world's last surviving water-powered water-powered needle scouring mill, with most of the machinery still in place. No story of Redditch's needle industry is complete without talking about one famous company, and that is Abel Morrall. So the company Abel Morrall was established in 1785 by Michael Morrall, who was kind of taught the skill of needle making by his uncle. And what kind of set Morrall apart from the competition was their kind of commitment to quality and innovation. They really strived to kind of make better needles rather than just selling them. And kind of as the demand for Redditch made needles kind of grew, because people knew Redditch was the shit. They knew the needles were quality. As the company kind of expanded to be one of the town's best manufacturers, the name became synonymous with precision, producing sewing needles, knitting needles, and many other specialized products that involve needles of some sort, like surgical needles, fishing needles, things like that. And these were exported all around the world. And for example, in 1793, they worked with a watchmaker because they wanted to try and improve the way their eyes were drilled on the needles, which they did, but because of like how much it cost to kind of manufacture the needles, they kind of just scrubbed it, which is kind of sad. But one of the most interesting things was how they kind of adapted to the changing industry. They invested in new machinery, they developed new product lines, and they promoted goods through catalogs, as I'll show you later. So I found this really interesting website that kind of documented the whole history of the Abel Morrall family and company as a whole. So I'll read you this kind of extract from the website that was really interesting. They continued to experiment during the 1810s in an attempt to find a new way to make the eyes and needles. At the time, each needle had to be punched separately with a special tool to make the eye, a very slow and time-consuming process. By 1820, they were able to patent a stamping press that could punch the eyes into two needles at the same time, greatly increasing the speed with each needle made. Several years later, in 1823, they patented a burnishing machine to smooth the eyes of needles, and it was able to handle 100 needles at a time. Some of their greatest achievements, however, occurred in 1839. First, they invented a machine to straighten needles, a device that in 1 hour could accomplish what would have taken 12 by hand. They also patented several improvements to the early machinery for burnishing or smoothing the eyes, therefore removing fragments of metal left after the stamping process, or any other imperfections that could cause the thread to break. So they were really just doing it. They were like the Apple of the days. Like, they were just constantly innovating and were like, we're going to make this amazing. And, you know, props to them, honestly. And the museum still preserves catalogues, products, and extensive family records of the Morrall business. By the end of the 19th century, Abel Morrall had grown into one of the largest and most respected needle companies in the world and in Redditch. And while many needle manufacturers were kind of trying to stay afloat, they kind of merged together because it became so competitive. However, Abel Morrall would just kind of sat there like, we are bossing it. And in 1898, the company made one of the most important decisions in their history. Although it had been highly successful in nearby Studley, which was also a kind of needle making place outside of Redditch, it recognised that Redditch had become the true centre of the needle trade because their kind of setup was in Studley. That's where their kind of main place was. It was like a few miles outside of Redditch. So yeah, it recognised that Redditch was the kind of true zone for where it's going to happen, the industry. So to kind of establish a stronger presence there, they ended up merging with a Redditch firm called Lewis and Bayliss, who had a factory that was on a road called Clive Road, which was right next to the train station. And this location was obviously This location was no accident, because being next to the railway transformed the business, allowing finished products to be exported and shipped quickly across Britain and exported across the world. As the global demand for Redditch-made needles continued, this effective transport became just as important as the skilled craftsmanship of the needles. This merger also solved another long-standing issue, because Lewis and Bailey had previously acquired another needle business called Francis Morrall, and obviously they share the same family name, so buying that business and merging with it kind of gave them that kind of branding back and kind of helped avoid confusion. Because if you have two needle brands called Morrall, that is confusing. So that's some good business and stuff. Business strategy there. So if you think about it, protecting your brand name is very, very important. And I think this is really funny, this next story that I'm going to tell you. So in 1901, they basically had to take legal action against another needle company because the firm basically bought a a business called J.Y. Morrall, and they then began using the name Morrall name to kind of market their needles as Morrall needles, to kind of confuse the public and make them think that they're like the good Morrall needles. And I was like, that's so sneaky, that's so naughty. But they won a lawsuit. So innovation continued throughout the 20th century, and in 1936 the company introduced its new Aero trademark, and they started to expand into kind of different areas. So it wasn't just sewing anymore, it was like knitting, crochet, all this stuff. The Aero name would actually become the best known brand produced by the company. More you know. However, as the needle industry started to decline during the kind of later 20th century, the business had to evolve, and in 1979 Abel Morrall Limited officially changed its name to Aero Needles Group Limited, because the brand was so popular, they were like, people need to recognize us for that. So in order to kind of reflect the growing importance of this brand, 5 years later, in 1984, the company was acquired by Coat Patons, which were one of the world's leading textile businesses. And in 1991, it became part of the English Needle and Fishing Tackle Company. Although the company did change ownership like a few times over the years, Abel Morrall remains as one of the most significant and most important like names in Redditch and in British industrial history. It represents more than just like a successful business, but like the story of like innovation and quality and determination, and it helped transform a like small town outside Birmingham into like the needle making capital of the world. And that is crazy. But like, why did the needle industry like decline? Like, what happened? And I think the answer is quite simple. Like, no industry really lasts forever, and by the 20th century there was so much competition, like because you had manufacturers overseas producing cheaper products, newer machinery came across, and it meant lower production costs. And after 2 world wars and like decades of economical change, many of the towns like infrastructure ended up being closed down, and that led to, in 1958, Forge Mill's water-powered scouring mill finally fell silent. I just got goosebumps. However, while the industry did decline, the legacy does survive. Today, Forge Mill stands as a rare reminder of the town that once supplied almost every sewing needle in the world, a place where the story of British craftsmanship, innovation, and industry continues to inspire generations. I've gone goosebumpy again. Oh my god, my writing's deep. So thank you for watching this amazing video. Stay tuned. I don't know how I'm going to edit this, so I don't know what's coming next. I'll think of something. But yeah, thank you for watching if you made it to the end of this video. If you did, comment needle, because it's topical. I think it's really important for us to kind of learn about these like industries that you don't necessarily hear about. Like going to this museum and seeing all of the history there and how it's kind of impacted quite a lot of different other industries. And I was like, that's so interesting, because obviously I'm a knitter. I don't use sewing as much, so I never kind of understood the importance of it, but now I do, and it's very interesting. If you ever are in the area, I suggest you go. It's super cool, it's super interesting. Yeah, but just watch out for that creepy woman in the basement, because she scared the fuck out of me twice.
Hello.
Oh. But yeah, thank you so much for the Forge Mill for having me. They were amazing. But yeah, if you've enjoyed this video and you want to watch some more, I've got quite a lot of videos that are just me talking about absolute shite, but they are interesting if you like a bit of history and if you like a bit of knitting. Also, feel free to join as a member. I can't remember if you get any perks, but you get to... I'm trying to make this my full-time job, basically, because I absolutely love talking about knitting. I love knitting, it's my life. I don't want to work a 9 to 5, so supporting me, liking and sharing the video can make me bring me, I'm having a stroke, bring me closer to that dream of becoming a full-time YouTuber. So if you want to follow me on social media, you can do. All my links will be below. You can also buy me a coffee if you want to support me. I mean, you could also cyberball me as well, and that'd be quite funny. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video of me attempting to make a historical